For those of you who were upset that we didn't get a 28 months later before 28 years later, well, we might still get 28 months later. Horror fans are excited about 28 years later that comes out in June this year, and rightfully so, because it does look like one of the best horror movies of the year, and it certainly is one of the most expensive horror movies of the year, coming in at around $70 million for the production budget alone. But there are fans out there of the 28 Days Later franchise that are a bit upset that they didn't get 28 months later. And I can see where they're coming from because naturally we had 28 days later, then 28 weeks later, and then we're skipping all the way to 28 years later. Now, it makes sense to make it 28 years later because we're almost at the year 2030 anyway, which would be 28 years later. So it makes no sense to pull it back to 28 months later, especially if you're bringing back previous characters. Yes, they're bringing back previous characters. So instead of de-aging those characters, you might as well just make those characters look round about the age they are today. But where does 28 months later come into it, you ask? Well, there are two movies confirmed at the moment, 28 years later. Then the second one's going to be 28 years later, The Bone Temple, which has been confirmed for January 2026. And they're trying to make it a trilogy, depending on the success of these two movies, which I'm hopeful that they'll be successful. Then there is a third movie planned, and the rumours are that Danny Boyle will come back to direct this third and final movie, and there is no title for it yet. Now, what they could do is there's two options here depending on what happens with the Bone Temple. One, they could make it a sequel to the Bone Temple and call it 28 months later. And you might be thinking, well, that makes no sense. Well, it does make sense because what they could do is make it set 28 months after the events of the Bone Temple. Now, the other option would be call it 28 months later and make it a prequel to 28 years later. That's something I've been thinking about for quite a while. But when you think about it, you could just set it 28 months after the events of the Bone Temple, which would still be in the future. But then it plays with your OCD. Now, when I say OCD, I've just made a startling discovery online when I mentioned this idea of 28 months later online. It's not actually called OCD. It's called OCPD. And I thought, what? No, this has got nothing to do with the movie. I had to Google this, and it's OCPD. I had no idea this existed. I used to always say to people, oh, my OCD makes me want to organize this way and this way and that way. But it's actually called OCPD. It stands for Obsessive Compulsive Personality Disorder. I'll quickly read this out. Obsessive Compulsive Personality Disorder is a chronic mental condition that involves an unhealthy pattern of perfectionism, orderliness as well. So yeah, it's definitely OCPD and not OCD. But going back to 28 years later, it would look strange on your shelf if you buy physical media and see 28 days, weeks, years, months. I sound like the actual song there. Boots, boots, coming up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. There's no discharge in the war. But I think that's two options that they could look at for 28 months later. If they really want to appease fans that love the word months, then that's two options for them. Make it a prequel to 28 years later, or set it 28 months after the events of the Bone Temple. We know that shit's going to go down at the end of the Bone Temple. What's going to happen, we've no idea. But if they leave it on a cliffhanger, then the option is there to set it 28 months after the events of the Bone Temple. But if they finish it with the Bone Temple because they don't know if they're going to make a third one or not for definite, if they give us a definitive ending because they don't know where they're going to go with this, then they've got the option there. They can do a sequel if they want to squeeze another one out, or they can go, do you know what? The Bone Temple is the end, but if we want to do a third one in this new trilogy, then the option is there to make it a prequel to 28 years later. And the obvious choice of the name would be 28 months later. So what are your thoughts on that, guys? It's just a thought. Everybody wants to call it 28 months later because we missed that. So that is the option. That is their chance to call it 28 months later. Are you fussed about the word months being in this franchise anyway, guys? Leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you soon.
Meeting adjourned.
I'll be right back.
What are you waiting for, huh?
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played in the cat?
Someone's in the